In June 1942, an atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean became the stage for one of the most brutal and significant battles of the entire Second World War. At Midway, the American and Japanese fronts clashed, staining the oceanic waters with blood and molten metal. After 3 days, nearly 3,500 people had perished in one of the most astonishing humiliations suffered by the Japanese Empire. In this installment of military history, we invite you to enter that hell wearing the uniform of the Japanese Navy, to understand how that battle unfolded from their perspective. Sunken aircraft carriers, downed ships, and thousands of lives extinguished. How was it possible? Today, we will find out. Before the Second World War, the Empire of Japan presented itself to the world as an invincible power. Japanese troops had defeated on several occasions the countries that would form the Allied bloc, thus demonstrating their tactical and material superiority. These victories allowed the small island to conquer Hong Kong, Shanghai, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and countless nearby territories. All this expansionist zeal was summarized in a concept created and promoted by imperial authorities, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Essentially, it represented the dream of creating a bloc similar to the Soviet Union, but with Asian nations that would be led by Japan to finally liberate themselves from European influence. From the Japanese island, they felt that their military superiority also translated into racial superiority. They believed that portion of the planet belonged to Japan by right, echoing the idea of Nazi living space. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Admiralty carried out an operation that changed history. That morning, Pearl Harbor was attacked by a number of bombers never before seen, turning the American base into a floating inferno. The images captured during that day circled the globe, and as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt described it, that would be a date which will live in infamy.
Here is the actual bombing of the mighty USS Arizona by Jap planes. These pictures were made by a fearless cameraman who thought nothing of his personal safety to make possible this record for all posterity. A single lucky hit was responsible for the disaster that befell the Arizona when a Jap bomb falling directly through one of the battleship's funnels exploded in the engine room and set ablaze tons of fuel oil.
The Japanese attack was intended as a preemptive action to prevent the intervention of the United States Pacific Fleet in the military actions planned by the Empire of Japan in Southeast Asia. However, the attack that dragged the United States into World War II was only partially successful. The large American aircraft carriers were not anchored in port as the Japanese had hoped, so their effort failed to destroy Uncle Sam's maritime projection capability. From one of those legendary aircraft carriers, the USS Hornet, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers took off on April 18, 1942, and bombed the city of Tokyo, causing panic among the population. In May of the same year, the Americans used their carriers to thwart Japanese movements towards Australia during the Battle of the Coral Sea. The powerful American response convinced Japanese high command that they needed to strike at enemy aircraft carriers if they wanted to continue dreaming of total conquest of Southeast Asia. Let's hear the words of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo.
帝国の流体、東亜の荒廃、まさにこの一戦にあり、一億国民が一切を挙げて国に報い、国に準ずるの時は今であります。発行を家となす公募のもとに、この人中報告の大精神ある限り、英米といえども何ら恐るるに足らないのであります。
According to information provided by Japanese intelligence, the American aircraft carriers were sailing in waters near Midway Islands, an atoll located in the North Pacific, near the northwestern end of the Hawaiian archipelago. The name Midway refers to its geographical position. being halfway between America and Asia. With this in mind, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto proposed a risky theory. He believed that remaining on the defensive against a power with the industrial might and human resources of the United States would be suicidal. Therefore, he devised an offensive plan to be executed at this strategically valuable atoll. The concept was to cause such an impact that it would force the enemy to negotiate for peace, allowing Japan to retain the conquered lands. In mid-April 1942, the Japanese decided that their best option was to lure the American aircraft carriers to sink them all, and then take Midway with the aim of expanding their defensive perimeter in the Pacific. This operation was seen as preparation for invading Fiji and Samoa, as well as potentially advancing towards Hawaii. The occupation of the atoll, similar to the attack on Pearl Harbor, was not part of a campaign to conquer America, but rather aimed at eliminating the strategic power of the Americans in the Pacific Ocean. This would allow the Japanese a clear path to establish a significant sphere of political and economic influence in the region. Like all Japanese plans during World War II, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan was complex and based on certain assumptions. Firstly, from the Japanese perspective, the only available aircraft carriers to defend Midway were the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet. The USS Lexington had been sunk, and they believed the USS Yorktown had suffered serious structural damage in the Battle of the Coral Sea. However, after quick repairs at Pearl Harbor, the Yorktown was back in action, unbeknownst to the Japanese. Even more significant was what the Japanese assumed about American morale. Japanese high command was convinced that their rival was demoralized and unmotivated due to their frequent defeats in the preceding 6 months. Yamamoto felt that frustration could be crucial in luring the Americans into a trap, driven by a desire for revenge at any cost, thus definitively compromising their naval and air power in the Pacific Ocean. To achieve this, Yamamoto planned to disperse his forces so they could not be discovered before the battle, and then converge on the enemy with surprise and concentrated force once the confrontation began. As we mentioned earlier, it was a complex plan, but if successful, it would be a death sentence for the United States. The reality was that the Japanese were very confident, perhaps overly so to the point of overlooking some fundamental issues. For instance, capturing Midway required an unprecedented amphibious assault operation. Up to that point, the Japanese Navy had only conducted such attacks in undefended or lightly defended areas. The atoll was a small territory, so it was certain that there would be American presence across the entirety of Midway, further complicating the landing. And that wasn't the only obstacle. There were also natural challenges standing between Japan and its imperial dreams. The atoll is surrounded by vast coral reefs, which are a deadly trap for any unprepared amphibious vessel. Even at high tide, the water depth was barely enough for Asian boats to cross the reef without suffering structural damage. This meant that the invasion would largely have to be conducted by air, placing excessive importance on the imperial aircraft carriers. The success or utter failure of the mission depended entirely on the performance of these ships, which proved to be a fatal decision. Let's return to the final days of April 1942, when the Japanese Admiralty was preparing its strategy.
The problem with the Japanese was that they had scattered their fleet over a very wide area. It was organised into component parts, none of which could support each other. So, in effect, as a total number, the Japanese outnumbered the Americans, but when it came to a face-to-face battle, they didn't.
In order to deceive the enemy, Yamamoto dispersed his ships so that all remained hidden before the battle. His group of battleships and supporting cruisers followed Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's aircraft carriers several hundred kilometers away. Their mission was to approach and destroy any elements that could defend Midway after being weakened by attacks from the aircraft carriers. What the Admiral did not know was that this tactic would prevent him from properly defending his positions, ultimately giving the advantage to the enemy. Even worse, Something he could not have known was that American spies had managed to decipher the Japanese naval code and were able to translate several of their secret messages. But remember, today we will focus on the Japanese perspective of this legendary battle. On June 3, 1942, the Japanese attacked the Aleutian Islands as a diversionary maneuver, and the next day the Battle of Midway began. The Japanese fleet then headed towards Midway, consisting of 4 aircraft carriers, 9 battleships, 8 destroyers, 4 cruisers, and 433 combat aircraft. The Americans had 3 aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 360 combat aircraft. These numbers serve to illustrate the magnitude of this confrontation in the far reaches of the Pacific. This is how Imperial pilot Harada Kaname remembered his experience before taking off.
ところがね、もう飛行機に乗ってみたらもうそこで海がすぐ近くで、果たしてこれは罹患できるかなというふうに思ったんですけども、もうそんなこと言ってる場合じゃないもんで、整備員にもしっかり捕まえてもらっていて、オーバーブーストまでやって、それで、走らせたらすぐもう脚を引っ込めの、操作をやりました。どうやら船から離れてザーッと進んでいって、これは落ちるかなと思ったら、それでもそこで浮力がついてどうやら上がりましたね。
The next day, in the early morning of June 4th, Japanese Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched a wave of 108 aircraft against Midway. At the same time, he deployed reconnaissance aircraft to locate the enemy fleet. Japanese Zero fighters managed to shoot down 17 American units that came out to confront them. Not a single Japanese aircraft was shot down. From that moment on, the Japanese bombed and strafed the atoll, destroying gasoline depots, seaplane hangars, observation towers, vehicles, and anti-aircraft artillery. Around 6:30 in the morning, Japanese aircraft carriers severely damaged the American base with a second wave of bombers. In the skies, aircraft from both sides fought fiercely, resulting in a large number of shootdowns and explosions. As minutes passed, Uncle Sam's pilots began to gain the upper hand and force the withdrawal of large Japanese air units.
Japanese planes were shot down by the score. One flew slap into this.
Of the 108 Japanese aircraft used in this initial advance on Midway, 11 were destroyed, 14 suffered severe damage, and another 29 required repairs. With these figures, and considering that American bombers could still use parts of the base to refuel and return to attack, the first wave was considered a failure. It was crucial to intensify hostilities if they intended to establish a foothold for a large-scale landing in the following days. The Japanese officer in charge of the operation, Joichi Tomonaga, communicated to Admiral Nagumo that it was necessary to launch a second raid to complete the destruction of the base. In the first attack on Midway, he had opted to equip reserve aircraft with torpedoes, fearing they might encounter American ships. Therefore, conducting a second offensive was essential, as the atoll's airstrip had not been destroyed due to the lack of ground bombs. All aircraft in the second wave, including reserve planes, were ordered to be armed with bombs to destroy the island's facilities, an order that proved fatal. The major problem was that replacing torpedoes would take a long time, at least half an hour per aircraft. In the midst of this process, a lagging Japanese cruiser delivered Nagumo the worst possible news. 10 enemy ships were heading towards Midway. Consumed by panic, Nagumo ordered all aircraft to be brought back up to the deck and the bombs to be exchanged for torpedoes, further wasting time in a battle where the clock was the main antagonist. It was then that some American ships detected the Japanese aircraft carriers at their most vulnerable moment, when the deck was filled with planes loaded with torpedoes. If these were destroyed, the resulting explosions could be devastating and potentially sink them to the bottom of the Pacific. And so it happened. The explosion of Japanese aircraft armed with torpedoes also ignited the fuel depots, causing the 3 hit aircraft carriers to sink. It was a devastating blow for the Japanese. Once again, let's hear the words of Harada Kanami.
だから我々は見たところがその下張ってくるんですよ、雷撃隊ね。これを盛んに攻撃をやってたんですよね。そしたら上へそのドントリスが来てるわけです。それを知らないんですよね。だから向こうの魚雷は一発も当たってないはずです。ところがその時に上にドントリスが来てて、このドントリスにうまく命中させられてしまって、ああいう大悲劇を受けたわけですよね。
Imagine you are a Japanese sailor who has been educated for years in the Japanese doctrine of military and racial superiority. Before departing for Midway, your superiors described to you a master plan designed to send the enemy's main ships to the bottom of the ocean, one of the great Western powers. Everything is on your side: geography, surprise, and the number of ships. The problem is that when the moment of combat arrives, in the blink of an eye, hundreds of your comrades are killed. Thousands more are stranded. Your nation's maritime strength burns in flames on the waves of the Pacific. It is truly difficult to comprehend the shock felt by the Japanese troops in the face of such a crushing and unexpected defeat. Admiral Nagumo had to make difficult decisions during the days of the Battle of Midway. According to Japanese naval doctrine, large-scale and organized aerial attacks were favored over deploying small numbers of aircraft to defend or attack specific points. The idea was to overwhelm the enemy with the quantity and intensity of the attack. However, to achieve this, accurate information about the enemy's positions and movements was crucial. Otherwise, you would be sending a powerful fleet to its demise. Lacking such information, Nagumo chose the doctrinal approach and held back a reserve of aircraft on the carriers until he could organize a large-scale launch. Many argue that if he had deployed the available force, they could have potentially sunk some of Washington's carriers. Of course, these are just speculations. History has already been written, and this particular one had a clear victor. The Hiryu, the only intact Japanese aircraft carrier, launched its planes against the USS Yorktown, causing serious damage. However, shortly after, the Hiryu was attacked by bombers from the Enterprise, leaving it severely damaged and sinking the next day. Upon being informed of the loss of all 4 carriers, Admiral Yamamoto gave the order to withdraw. On June 6th, during that retreat, American aircraft bombed the cruiser Mikuma, which sank with 650 sailors on board. The campaign that had presumed Japan's victory ended in one of its worst humiliations.
Now putting to sea with a U.S. Navy cameraman, we see a new chapter just released of the great American naval victory at Midway, the attack on the carrier Yorktown. Filmed under fire, the battle that cost the Japs 10 warships, 4 carriers, and nearly 300 planes. Damaged by direct hits, the gallant Yorktown steams on. Her flight deck ablaze, the crew calmly fights the flames as gunners keep up their withering barrage of anti-aircraft fire.
The Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, 250 aircraft, and 3,057 men, including sailors and pilots. These pilots were the most skilled and experienced in the Japanese Air Force. There was no doubt. The United States not only won, but also demonstrated that it was stronger than ever and willing to fight to the end to avenge what happened at Pearl Harbor. The significance of the battle on that small atoll cannot be underestimated. It was a turning point in World War II, with many attributing Japan's defeat in the Pacific to this failure, a viewpoint supported by strong arguments. Losing 4 out of their 6 aircraft carriers left Japan unable to pursue further conquests in Asia and the Pacific Ocean. After Midway, Japan lost military initiative and adopted a defensive posture, which its admirals had diagnosed as a serious mistake. For the first time in the war, the number of Japanese and American ships was equalized, with the advantage that American industry could build new aircraft carriers more quickly. In fact, by 1945, Washington managed to launch 35 aircraft carriers, while the Japanese barely compensated for those lost at Midway.
America is building freighters by day and night. Red-hot rivets and red-hot rivet catchers are on the job. They're turning out the ships, and the ships are delivering the goods.
The production capacity was central to what happened in the rest of the War of the Pacific. The American industrial machine was gearing up in 1942, and its products really started to come out in mass numbers in 1943.
Analyzing Japan's defeat from the perspective of its admirals and soldiers, it's possible to identify a factor that condemned the empire throughout the conflict: overconfidence and limitless imperialistic vision. Every Japanese man was convinced that their nation could defeat any army on the planet. At the same time, there was blind faith in the complicated military strategies of their officers, which relied not only on the capability of their men, but also on luck. Relying on fate and fortune is not uncommon in wartime, but it should be the exception rather than the rule. Finally, the primary reason for Japan's failure was the lack of emphasis on intelligence work. Having a gigantic and well-prepared fleet is excellent, but it's useless if your soldiers operate with unconfirmed information and your messages are intercepted by the enemy. For all these reasons and more, the American victory at Midway remains a fascinating and pivotal chapter in World War II. Thus, we reach the end of the video. If you enjoyed this content and want to continue learning about the most important conflicts of the 20th century, we invite you to subscribe and enable notifications on our channel. Without further ado, we bid farewell until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.